Welcome to this reading from the Human Drama textbook. This section is titled Industrialization Changes the Way People Live. Whether we call the developments we have been discussing the Industrial Revolution or an ongoing process of industrialization, few would argue that industrialization fundamentally changed human life. The new technology drastically altered social arrangements in the nations that industrialized. Industrialism also created a revolution in world power, leaving the non-industrialized countries, especially India and China, in their economic wake for 2 centuries. Industrialization still continues as the nations left behind now try to catch up. Whatever we choose to call this process, its impact on our lives around the world has been and continues to be profound. The Industrial Revolution also ushered in the possibility of fundamental changes in the way people live. It helped destroy many centuries-old institutions, created new ones, and fundamentally altered human social relationships and collective values. People who live through industrialization experience seminal changes in such things as their standard of living, family life, the concept of work, workplace conditions, the place of women and children in society, and how wealth is distributed. During all significant social changes, some groups prosper, some move easily to a new way of life without much loss, and others become the casualties of social change, the victims, perhaps, of social change. Changing values. Industrialized society became obsessed with being on time. Most factories had bell towers that rang at various times of day. At the mills in Lowell, Massachusetts, a bell awakened the mill girls who lived in boarding houses at 4:30 a.m. They went to breakfast at the call of a bell. They arrived at work with the ring of a bell, and so on until the quitting time bell at the end of a 10-hour day. They even went to bed when the tower bell rang at 10. The new concept of time imposed by the new industrial order was radically different than in the agricultural societies that had flourished until the advent of industrialization. For rural farmers, time was a far less urgent concept than it became in the new factories, where every wasted minute cost the owners money. Farmers usually experienced an extended period of downtime between intense periods of work, during which they worked on crafts or enjoyed leisure. If a person felt like working, he did so. If he celebrated too much at a wedding, he could sleep late and compensate the next day by working longer than usual. While working in the fields, a farmer could take a break for water or food that his wife or children brought to him. In the new industrial society, the personal decisions and choices of an agrarian farming age were fast disappearing under the demands of mass production. Instead of maintaining their relationship with the land and the movement of days and seasons, industrial workers were becoming hands, faceless members of the masses, alienated from nature and its rhythms, and controlled instead by the incessant ticks of the ever-present clock. Differences among the classes. The rapid rise of the middle classes in Europe and the United States is one of the most dramatic historic changes during the Industrial Age. By and large, people in the middle class did not perform manual labor. Instead, they made their living providing services, making investments, or in management. At the lower end were teachers, nurses, clerks, bookkeepers, policemen, and other service personnel. In the middle were professors, doctors, lawyers, and small businessmen such as shopkeepers. At the top were the mill owners, investment bankers, and successful merchants who imported raw materials and marketed the newly available goods. Within the ideal 19th century middle-class family, there was a distinct division of labor. Gone were the craft guilds, where both men and women lived and worked in close proximity. Most middle-class women were not employed for either wages or salaries. In the new, quote, ideal family, women stayed at home, taking care of the children, while the husband supported the family by earning a salary working outside the home. Women who did work outside the home usually had to accept lower pay than men and were given far less respect than middle-class men. Instead of trying to raise women's wages, reformers campaigned to ensure that men earned, quote, a family wage so they could support their families. Many lower-class families had to depend on both the women and men working outside the home in order to survive. The factory worker lost status, in part because the family often depended on his wife's and children's wages, as well as his own, while a middle class man gained status because he could afford to let his wife stay at home and the family could send the children to school and even to college. By the end of the 1800s, jobs such as nursing, teaching, and secretarial work were opening up for women. However, very few women entered the upper reaches of the middle class, where the nation's real power rested. Industrialization changed workers' lives dramatically. Initially, the status of farmers who had owned and farmed small plots of land or had worked at farming for wages was undermined by the extensive use of women and children in factories. Workers no longer lived on a plot of land that they could farm when things got bad. They had no support when they could no longer work at the factory, and no insurance when they got injured at the job. Because industrial scale textile production required far less skill than hand cottage industry, machines were often considered more valuable than workers. Even the economic and social status of skilled workers diminished. Between 1780 and 1800, the wages of British spinners and weavers fell by a third, and by the 1830s by two-thirds. The demands on workers were immense. Because the machines were very expensive, owners ran them 24 hours a day in order to make a profit. Causing a machine to shut down, for whatever reason, was a terrible sin for textile workers. Factory work was capricious, dangerous, and paid meager, that is low, wages. Women workers had no privacy, and there were no toilets or washrooms set aside for them. They got no special treatment, even when they were pregnant. During an economic slump, workers could be fired without recourse or reason. There was little light or ventilation in the factories. They were dirty, dark, and dangerous. The dust and floating pieces of thread thrown off by the machines filled the air and also workers' lungs. The early factories were unsanitary, and there were no safety precautions. Workers' bodies were frequently caught up and mangled by the machines. Injuries on the job were routine, and the injured worker usually was blamed. Wounded workers were often put out on the street untreated. Poor children were the most unfortunate victims of industrialization. Some mills even hired 4- and 5-year-olds. Small children were also employed in mines to crawl into narrow spaces and to carry baskets of coal up steep ladders. One English girl described her daily routine to a Mines Commission investigation in 1842. I have 12 brothers and sisters. Ah, man, this accent sucks. Let's see. Alright, I guess I'll just say in English, a regular accent. I have 12 brothers and sisters. They weave and wind and pull a coal wagon. One of them can read, none of the rest can, or write. They never went to school. I came down into the mine at 7 o'clock. I go up from the mine at 6, sometimes even 7. I do not like working in the pit, but I am obliged to get a living. Most workers' children did not go to school and remained illiterate. A British investigation of child labor in 1850 found a boy of 17 who could not add 2 and 2 together. Other boys had never heard of London, could not name the British Queen, and never heard of Napoleon. One child had heard the name Jesus Christ, but didn't know who he was. Workers had to rent rooms in large cities that were smaller, dirtier, and more expensive than housing in small villages. They tried to keep their large families together in these ugly, disease-ridden slums. Manchester was filled with houses whose back rooms had no windows. Cholera and other epidemics were common. An English commission in 1842 reported that the filth and lack of sanitation caused more deaths than any modern wars England fought. In his novel Hard Times, Charles Dickens, a keen observer of the misery of workers, described Coketown, the place where steel is made. It contained several large streets, all very like one another, and many small streets still more like one another, inhabited by people equally like one another, who all went in and out at the same hours, with the same sound upon the same pavements, to do the same work, and to whom every day was the same as yesterday and tomorrow, and every year the same counterparts of the last and the next. With the precious free time men had, they often visited public houses, pubs, where they could buy cheap gin and beer. Drinking helped them forget their bitter lives and provided moments of escape from the drudgery of long, hard days of work. Although the wealth of England shot up with the onset of industrialization, it was not until after 1850 that its benefits began to trickle down and the lives of English workers began to improve. In 1700, the English per capita income was $110 per year. In 1810, it was over $700 per year. But during that time, workers' wages remained nearly stagnant, while others' income rose. Further, the economies of the industrializing nations experienced cycles of prosperity and times of unemployment and high prices, good times and bad times. Workers had no way of protecting themselves from these economic swings. There were no unions to hear their grievances, and troublesome complaints often resulted in immediate firing. You got a complaint, you're fired. There were few protests and strikes, but the owner-friendly police violently suppressed these outbursts. The low wages and long hours the laborers worked enabled mill owners to make huge profits, some of which they invested in new equipment. However, in the first two generations of the Industrial Revolution in England, the negative effects of the rapid growth and dramatic increase in manufacturing and national wealth were borne largely by the unskilled workers who labored long hours in harsh and unhealthy conditions. The landed aristocracy was at the top of the social pyramid. In 1850, members of this small class in England still owned more than half the farmland. They relied on tenant farmers or poorly paid workers to do the work on their estates. There was a constant need for food for city dwellers, whose numbers kept increasing. Many large landowners pushed peasants off the land so they could grow more commercial crops to sell in the cities. The British aristocracy continued to be the arbiters of taste and manners. They made up the House of Lords, which remained an important branch in the British Parliament until 1911, and is now an advisory body without real power. The relationship between the aristocrats and the middle class became both contentious and symbiotic. Newly wealthy upper middle class businessmen tried to copy the manners and tastes of the aristocrats. This meant speaking a fine Oxford English, with some slang words deliberately included, and owning old and expensive estates, complete with servants, groundskeepers, and a good supply of horses. The aspiring middle class mimicked aristocratic dress, dance styles, reading materials, and began drinking wine instead of beer. Many hoped a daughter would marry a member of the aristocracy, thereby indirectly buying a title and becoming lords themselves. In contemporary Great Britain, even famous entertainers like Elton John and Mick Jagger can be knighted. So you can be a knight today if you're British. So go become British and become a knight. Interestingly, members of the aristocracy and working classes both enjoyed a much freer moral code. While middle-class culture valued Puritan values such as chastity, that is, not having sex, for women, both workers and aristocrats lived much freer lives, with tolerance for extramarital affairs and generous consumption of alcohol. Members of the new middle class began to point to a number of cultural values and beliefs to justify their privilege, and at the same time to explain the lowly and miserable plight of workers. Their key value was respectability. Because they argued they were clean, disciplined, morally upright, and hardworking, they were bound to succeed. They were also active in their churches, and they volunteered for various charitable causes. The term middle-class morality that emerged in the 1800s continues to have currency even today. Most people who speak of middle-class values no longer mean chastity, but rather responsible, hardworking people who obey the rules, are self-reliant, and plan for their future. Aristocrats and members of the middle class thought that workers were lazy. They drank too much, used vulgar terms, didn't attend church, and were slovenly in their habits. Because of these bad habits, they were doomed to a life of hard labor. Well-intentioned English middle-class female reformers focused on closing the pubs and forming temperance societies aimed at freeing workers from the sin of alcoholism, a disease that they truly believed was proof of the factory workers' low moral character. Reformers hoped that self-discipline and good morality would solve the workers' moral problems. It's not difficult to see that turning the irresponsible working man into an uncomplaining laborer would result in more money for mill or factory owners who hired these laborers. That may be one reason the owners supported these charitable ventures. In efforts to shift workers away from strong drink, tastemakers introduced tea and coffee as substitute beverages. I'm drinking tea right now. Delicious. Tea not only served as a mild stimulant for tired workers, when mixed with sugar and milk, it provided workers with much needed calories. They can drink their calories, and then they could work more. Hooray! In 1760, Britain imported 5 million pounds of tea. By 1800, tea imports had risen to 20 million pounds. At that time, British workers and miners were spending 5% of their wages on tea, or 10% if they added sugar. Before long, many English conversations were punctuated by the ubiquitous question, would you like a cup of tea? In coffee drinking culture, such as France and the United States, coffee breaks played much the same role for their workers as tea does in England. This next section is called Capitalism and its Critics. Traders, merchants, and other businessmen have always sought strategies to make profits. They figure out ingenious ways to attract investors, to get their goods to market, and to entice new consumers to buy what they have to sell. They often finance their businesses by borrowing money, using lines of credit, or reinvesting their profits. These strategies are all aspects of capitalism. The seeds of capitalism existed long before the economic dominance of European and American businessmen. Merchants who first handled surplus goods during the agricultural revolution tried to make profits, and they often reinvested some of those profits in new ventures. Muslim businessmen during the Abbasid Caliphate developed many financial strategies we now associate with capitalism, including banks, letters of credit, and checks. By the time of the Song dynasty, Chinese merchants had developed sophisticated systems to enhance trade that included the use of cash, their word for money, banking, insurance, letters of credit, and bookkeeping. In Europe, after the 1400s, the Fuggers and the Medicis were successful proto-capitalists who used many of these strategies in their city-states, in Italy and in Germany. Well, what becomes Italy and Germany, that is. By the 17th century, the 1600s, capitalist structures dominated trading systems and shaped the policies of major states, but they did not dominate production. Through most of history, businessmen have worked chiefly as merchants, entrepreneurs, and financiers rather than the direct organizers of production. During the Industrial Revolution, the financiers not only controlled the market where goods were bought and sold, they also owned the factories where the goods were produced. This transition to ownership defined modern industrial capitalism. How does capitalism work? The Scotsman Adam Smith explained modern capitalism in his book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, or just The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. Smith stressed the importance of producing manufactured goods and argued that a high percentage of a nation's workers should be involved in producing goods to sell. Smith claimed that it is not necessary for a nation to export more than it imports in order to remain solvent, which is what the mercantilists had believed. Smith criticized mercantilism and argued for free trade and economic competition. A product of the Enlightenment, Smith noted that the planets revolved around the sun in an orderly and systemic way. It follows, he believed, that human beings seeking their own self-interest should also look to natural law and follow their own paths of action without conflict if they would just allow market forces to operate with as little intervention as possible. Smith never used the term capitalism. Instead, he emphasized free competition and advocated letting supply and demand determine prices. He believed that supply and demand would establish equilibrium. For every buyer, there would be a seller. The government should rarely interfere in the market. If everyone was free to pursue his or her own economic interests, everyone would get better products at lower prices, and society in general would profit. Smith did not believe that reliance only on the free market would ensure a good society. He also anticipated economic depressions and warned that the market depends on the public's trust. When the people, quote, have such confidence in the fortune, probity, and prudence of the banker, and believe he is always ready to pay upon demand, his promissory notes, that is, his loans, those notes come to have the same currency as gold and silver money. Smith also stressed that a moral society must be the context for individual self-interest. He explained, quote, prudence, of all the virtues, is most useful to the individual, while humanity, justice, generosity, and public spirit are the qualities most useful to others. While championing free public markets, Smith also saw the need for a strong state, which alone could provide education and relief for those in need and support other institutions that promote a moral society. Without state support, he argued, the unemployed, quote, would either starve or by begging and want, famine, and mortality, that is death, would immediately prevail. He also argued for a strong government that would support institutions that the free market could not. He explained that the government must collect, quote, the revenue which must defray not only the expense of defending the society and of supporting the dignity of the chief magistrate, but also all the other necessary expenses of government. Is capitalism fair? Successful capitalists began to claim that they alone were responsible for expanding the Industrial Revolution by making investments in new technologies and improved systems of production possible. Some major capitalists, such as Henry Ford, were also inventors and technicians. More often, they convinced others to invest in their stocks and organized huge enterprises costing millions of dollars. In the process, they grew richer than any earlier class, except for the rulers who had always lived lavish lives off the sweat of their subjects. The height of competitive capitalism was between 1820 and the 1870s. During this time, the capitalists convinced the United States and most European governments to stop trying to regulate finance and investment and allow the, quote, free market forces to control the financial system. Ignoring Smith's concern for public morality and the state's responsibility for keeping competition free, his early disciples preached that the less government intervention in business, the better. These so-called laissez-faire is French, it means hands-off, capitalists, believed that the, quote, invisible hand of self-interest would motivate each person to maximize his profits, and that somehow all these personal desires would lead to a free, open, and stable society. Proponents of capitalism did recognize that some people fell on hard times, through no fault of their own, and were willing to offer temporary charity. However, their goal was simply to get the recipients of that charity quickly back on their feet so they could support themselves and their families. Otherwise, there were few circumstances where government should interfere with the sacred workings of the free market. However beneficial capitalism was supposed to be if free competition prevailed, it did not turn out that way. In the latter half of the 1800s, capitalist giants, especially those in the United States, managed to acquire all the divisions of a single industry and drove all the competitors from the field. For example, Andrew Carnegie controlled not only the making of steel, but its transportation, mining, and marketing as well. John D. Rockefeller controlled drilling for oil, but also many railroads, refineries, gas stations, and all other aspects of the oil industry. The giant companies suppressed workers' rights and destroyed all competitors by underselling them until they went bankrupt or had to sell. There were hosts of ingenious devices, such as cartels, holding companies, and trusts. Whole industries gradually fell under the control of a single person or group. Because of the monopolist capitalists had so much influence, few government officials dared challenge their power. Meanwhile, the capitalists continued to champion free competition and to justify their monopolies by arguing that they had won fairly. Critics of capitalism. While many embraced industrial capitalism, several important critics began to accuse it of exploiting the workers in order to enrich the middle and upper classes. Objecting to allowing industrialists to treat their workers any way they pleased, a growing number of people began to criticize the unsafe and degrading working conditions and blatant unfairness of the industrial system. Some of these critics were called socialists. The term socialism was first used by the French writer Saint-Simon in 1817 and Robert Fourier in 1825. Ideally, in their view, the government takes over the means of production, which includes factories, banks, and raw materials, and then runs them for the public good, for the good of the people, instead of making profits. Each citizen is provided with basic needs that include food, clothing, housing, and healthcare. Utopian socialists generally sought to build small communities that shared the wealth that had been produced equally. They believed that as other workers learned about these communities, they would want to join one, and gradually a national socialist system would emerge. The Englishman Robert Owen was also an important contributor to the socialist cause. He experimented with industrial cooperatives in Scotland, where workers and managers cooperated in running the factory and shared the profits. Later, Owen opened similar cooperative factories in Indiana. Karl Marx and his chief collaborator, Friedrich Engels, were the most powerful and elegant voices opposing capitalism. They alleged that capitalist factory owners charge more for their goods than the materials and labor actually cost. They do this by adding a surplus value to the goods they produce in order to make a profit. Calling the amount they added surplus value implied that only workers added value to products, while capitalists contributed nothing to the production of the goods. Marx believed that the owners and managers of the factories had taken away the tools for making goods that workers had previously owned, creating a workforce that was alienated from the things they produced and from society. The only hope workers had, according to Marx, was to see themselves as a worldwide exploited class that had much in common with other workers around the world. In his Communist Manifesto of 1848, he wrote, "The proletarians, the working class, have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite." This call became the slogan of various socialist and communist parties, as the workers, identified as the proletariat, developed in many industrial and non-industrialized nations. Karl Marx hoped that the working class, the proletariat, which was a class in itself, would become a class for itself, and that workers around the world would unite and work for common goals. By a class in itself, Marx meant that people who worked as industrial laborers shared the same plight and interests, but in their minds they did not realize that fact. A class for itself meant that workers would give up their false identifications, such as nationalism, language, and cultural values, and embrace class consciousness as workers. Marx called it a proletarian identity, saying, hey, German workers don't like French workers, but really they're all workers and should join together in an international working class. Marx and Engels saw no contradiction between philosophy and political action. They took part in the First Internationale, a gathering of world socialists founded in London in 1862, and it set the goal of, quote, proletarian revolution. The influence of Marx and Engels spread rapidly. Their disciples, as we shall see, took many different paths to achieve a classless society that would give the proletariat full equality. Less radical than socialism was social democracy, a policy that allowed private ownership of the means of production. The government would levy higher taxes on the well-to-do as a way of redistributing wealth to workers and guaranteeing that they could satisfy their basic needs. Well-known social democrats include Karl Liebknecht, Karl Kautsky, and Eugene Debs. Countries that have adopted social democracy are often referred to as welfare states because they seek to use part of the profits from capitalism to provide more benefits for the working class and the poor. Communists were far more radical than socialists. Claiming to follow Marx and Engels, they argued that violent revolution was the only way that the capitalists could be forced to give up their profits. They also believed that because getting workers to have class consciousness would take a long time, a small group must first create a political party to lead the revolution on behalf of the proletariat. These communist parties had little faith in voting because they believed that the capitalists controlled the press, the newspapers, government, school curriculum, and other means of shaping values. Most socialist and social democratic parties believe in democracy and argue that change has to come by the ballot box, by voting. Generally, socialists and social democrats form political parties and compete in local and national elections. In Europe, many of these parties have won elections and earned the right to govern. In the communist nations, armed revolution was the means of achieving national power, the most famous of which is the Soviet Union and Communist China. Communist parties saw themselves as the true representatives of the working people, even though they were not elected. Communist parties ruled in Russia from 1917 until 1989, and in China from 1949 to the present. Summary. By the end of the 1800s, the wealthy middle class in Great Britain had finally gained more political power than the aristocrats. Great Britain and the US were among the first nations to be controlled by representatives of this new industrial middle class. The creation of this new middle class had been the direct result of industrialization. From 1500 to 1800, Asian economies still dominated world trade. In fact, in 1750, India and China accounted for about 57% of the world's manufacturing, almost 60%. It was only after 1750 that new innovations in production, technology, and social arrangements gradually began to give the West, that is, Western Europe and the United States, more political and economic power. According to one major scholar, quote, industrialism changed the world balance of power. By 1800, European powers controlled some 30% of the Earth's land area. By 1914, they controlled 84%. Another historian echoes this point. Quote, in the past 250 years, the modern revolution has transformed the world. New research on the world economy has demonstrated that European economic dominance in the world system really began between 1750 and 1800, and not in 1500, when the Europeans first colonized the Americas. By about 1750, with the major European powers fully ascendant or rising in Asia, the age of European world dominance begins. The era of European colonialism will be the focus of the next unit. Thanks for listening. Have a good one. Bye-bye.